Thank you, Principal, Professor Boyne, Professor Weber, friends, colleagues at the University of Aberdeen. Professor Bourne, you may be right that there is more to life than academic study. It's a pleasure to be back here in Aberdeen. The last time I was here was about 1 year ago today, and the absent-minded professors among us, myself included, thought it would be a good idea to hold a lecture in the evening on the 14th of February. The trending social media hashtag among the students was that this would be, as the subject was also on the Transatlantic Alliance, the NATO Dato, Valentine's Day. Thank you very much for scheduling this august lecture around the same time of year, but on a different day so that we may enjoy the other pleasures of life a little later on this week. I'm honored to be here to speak with you. The subject of our talk tonight, and I hope it will be a genuine discussion in which I look forward to your questions and feedback, is about crises in the Transatlantic Alliance and the future of European defense. But let me cut to the end first. I'm bringing a message of good news. We're going to talk about crises, but ultimately my main argument tonight is that we have a lot of reason for optimism. Would anyone like to hear a message of optimism? Excellent, excellent. Let us proceed. Many of you are aware, however, there are some not so optimistic about the state of the Transatlantic Alliance. Among them, some credible sources. French President Emmanuel Macron has recently described what he called the brain death of the Transatlantic Alliance just last year in December. A couple of years ago, German Chancellor Angela Merkel famously observed that the days, and I'm paraphrasing, the days in which we Europeans may be able to rely on others exclusively for our defense are over. As many of you are no doubt aware, another president has repeatedly made statements, both on the campaign trail and then after his election, that NATO was obsolete. Do you know which president I'm talking about? This is a trick question, actually. There were two presidents who used this term. President Donald Trump used it recently, but the first president to use this, the first president to call NATO obsolete was in fact Charles de Gaulle in 1966. So what we're going to talk about tonight, and the reason I'm optimistic about the future of European defense and our transatlantic alliance, is because we've seen many of these crises before. And history teaches us not only some reasons to be optimistic about the resilience and adaptability of our alliance, but also teaches us some practical lessons about how we may improve it in the future. To assess the current sense of crisis in the alliance, I'd like to cover three broad areas in our discussion tonight. The first is to talk generally about how does the alliance change. I think that the alliance's capacity for adaptation is central to its resilience and endurance. So how does it change? Next, what kinds of arrangements seem to suit both European and American member states of this transatlantic alliance? And finally, what does that history really mean for us today? Where do we go from here? Allow me to begin with the first point then. How does the alliance change? The pattern of how NATO has adapted has been remarkably consistent across the decades. NATO celebrated its 70th anniversary last year, and during its 70-year history, it's endured a number of crises that I like to refer to as critical junctures. This is a term from the academic literature on historical institutionalism that refers to a period of time when the normal constraints on action in a bureaucracy are loosened for a relatively brief period of time. This loosening of constraints allows powerful actors to pursue new courses, to increase the likelihood of change, and indeed the possible momentousness of changes when they occur. Critical junctures in NATO follow a pretty consistent historical pattern. The first thing that tends to happen is there's some sort of external crisis that challenges the alliance. It renders its organization or its strategy unsuited to the times. The second phase of a critical juncture in NATO is one of contingency, where when those constraints on normal action are reduced, new ideas are proposed for how to address the new challenges of the day. And at that point, in the final phase, politics rules. Power, agency, structure, chance, these all play a role in the kinds of alternative arrangements to address the new security concerns that are seriously attempted or implemented. So there's a general theory, in brief, about how change comes to the Transatlantic Alliance. What does the 70-year history of change that has followed that pattern offer us? The history of critical junctures in NATO reveals not only the consistency of the process, but also some themes in the outcomes. The first of these themes in the outcomes is that when we're searching for new solutions to problems in the transatlantic relationship, there's often a desire for some kind of distinctively European approach to addressing the new challenges. And this can be laid in contrast to a transatlantic or an Atlanticist idea about how to solve new problems. An example of this is the 1950s era project to create a European defense community among European states that would have created something like a European army, something that is a proposal once again discussed today. Yet these European alternatives to the transatlantic relationship often do not come to full fruition or fulfill their ambition. That European defense community project of the 1950s was never implemented. In the post-Cold War era, many of you remember a great deal of enthusiasm about what was infamously called the Hour of Europe, a time when Europeans could take care of security challenges in the neighborhood in the Balkans. Ultimately, those efforts were not successful. Most recently, at an event in Washington, D.C., I had to observe somewhat awkwardly and feel some empathy for a European Union military official who had a grandly titled command of a flotilla of ships that was meant to be looking after security in the Mediterranean. And during the question and answer period, the gentleman sheepishly had to admit that, in fact, his European Union naval force had no ships. This is not to say that European initiatives have made no difference, but some of the most notable instances of European countries implementing their own security and defense agenda have often occurred through national or bilateral action, or a framework nation, such as the French have undertaken in North and West Africa. By contrast to the European-only efforts to address new problems in European security, NATO has shown a remarkable degree of adaptability, not least with its ability to co-opt or deal with non-NATO proposals for solving the new problems. The European defense community, about which we just spoke, for example, would have been integrated within NATO, and there was an entire NATO treaty protocol that would have provided for that. In response to some of the post-Cold War issues as well that we discussed, and the creation of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a renewed emphasis on dialogue during that time in the 1990s, NATO created its own mechanisms for dialogue with the Partnership for Peace and other initiatives like the NATO-Russia Council. Change in NATO does not always occur smoothly, but it's happened consistently throughout its history, conforming to that certain pattern of critical junctures that we discussed earlier. In fact, the biggest crises or critical junctures in NATO often end up producing the most long-lasting and successful change. This record of how NATO responds to crises is a source of confidence. It should be for us in its adaptability and in the resilience of the Transatlantic Alliance. We ought to be confident, but we ought not be complacent or reckless about this legacy of peace and security and the alliance that we share. NATO includes some enduring tension points that are frequently at the root of many of these crises, and they're overcome because of the vigilance and the hard work of all of us who believe in its importance and work to sustain it. What are some of the tensions today? One is a tension known as burden sharing, which is about the relative distribution of costs. This is a tension that has bedeviled the alliance since its earliest efforts to produce conventional military forces following the NATO Lisbon Summit in 1952. Those 1952 efforts failed, and the military capability and institutional dominance of the United States persisted and frustrated all sides for different reasons ever since. Another tension is a lack of consensus about the threats or priorities facing the alliance at a political level. NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, is said to have quipped that the alliance had not one founding purpose in the Cold War, but in fact three. These three founding purposes of NATO were to keep the Americans in Europe, to keep the Russians out of Europe, and to keep the Germans down in Europe. Today, the Allies agree to disagree on what they call the 360-degree approach, a slogan that thinly masks discord about whether the most important threats are somewhere to the east, the south, or from some other direction. And a final challenge that faces the alliance is the sheer encumbrance of getting anything done in an alliance of 30 countries that takes all decisions by consensus. So progress where it occurs is painstaking and slow. What does all this mean for today? This general pattern of how NATO adapts, some enduring substantive points of tension that we see in the history that have cropped up yet again today. Where are we now? Europe and the transatlantic relationship face challenges today that few would have foreseen 5 years ago. Let's rewind, actually, to 2014 to think about those days. Before Russia had annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine, the United States was still pursuing its rebalance of military and other presence away from Europe in the so-called pivot to Asia, and NATO had successively slashed its military structure. Its longest-running military operation in Afghanistan was supposed to be ending, and the perceived risks to European security remained low. This was before not only Russia invaded Ukraine, but also flouted the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, one of the foundational pillars of arms control in the post-Cold War era, and increased its confrontation with Western countries in many ways. All of this was before the migration crisis, the wave of terrorist attacks from the Islamic State that rocked Europe, an attempted coup in Turkey, and dare I say, the B word. This reversal in European stability and security also attended, quite frankly, some discontinuities in American foreign policy under the presidency of Donald Trump. But just as in previous critical junctures in the history of the Transatlantic Alliance, the current challenges have given rise to a creative and contingent period and a search for genuinely new ways for how to address them. So far, so good. We seem to be following the pattern of how NATO adapts and reacts to new challenges. Also following the pattern, historically, is that there are some new ideas that are exclusively European. The European Union is pursuing significant new initiatives in defense policy and capability development. The overarching idea in many of these is what's known as the development of an appropriate level of strategic autonomy. The meaning of this oft-cited phrase is contentious, not least among EU members, but the EU has nevertheless initiated several specific and practical efforts to bolster European defense capability and investment, the most significant of which are Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO, which is an EU treaty-based framework for cooperation on defense capability development and operational projects. There's also a European Defense Fund, which is a frankly novel approach that for the first time aims to make EU institutions a co-financer of defense investments. There's also a new EU initiative known as the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, or CARD, which is a renewed accountability and transparency mechanism comparable to the NATO defense planning process that's been around for many decades. So there are exclusively European efforts at addressing the new problems of the day. There are also a variety of efforts within NATO to adapt its own organization and strategy. Most of these NATO efforts revolve around a general idea that after a period of time where dialogue and out-of-area initiatives were most prominent, NATO is focused now largely on some roles that may seem more traditional, including defense and traditional, conventional, and nuclear deterrence. Many of its initiatives are noteworthy. They include the deployment of multinational battle groups to Eastern European members of the alliance, including Poland and the 3 Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. NATO is undertaking its largest military exercise program since the Cold War. There's been an adaptation and growth in the NATO military structure, the first and largest of its kind in 30 years. There's been a functional review of NATO political bodies, a recognition of conflict in the cyber domain. The first mention of China in NATO documents occurred at the London summit in December here just a couple of months ago. Also enhanced intelligence cooperation, and the once consensus but now contentious Wales Pledge on defense investment, in which all NATO allies pledged to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense every year. This is a large agenda. This is a serious agenda. It's an agenda that also, remarkably, brings NATO and the EU together in a way that we haven't seen in many years. More about that in a moment. A potentially astonishing conclusion overall is that there's more continuity than there is change in many of these efforts, historically speaking. The EU efforts at defense integration, the issue of NATO burden sharing, American attitudes and leadership within the alliance, the roles and values of the alliance generally, and political cohesion among the allies are all familiar challenges that are being addressed in familiar ways. That is a cause for optimism. Let me address what I mean in some more detail. These recent EU efforts strongly resemble previous efforts. So here we have a historical lesson. European states do not share a consensus view on autonomy, nor do they share a consensus regarding the level of ambition for European operational capabilities or equipment. Either way, the new PESCO project that I described is relatively thin on major proposals that would do anything to change that. Altogether, political disunity on the purpose of EU defense efforts and resistance from transatlantic forces favoring NATO and the United States all add up to a remarkable historical effort, or a remarkable historical echo of Europe's previous attempts at this kind of defense integration during the 1990s and during the 1950s. The results are likely to be similar. In NATO, there are also striking historical echoes, specifically on this issue of burden sharing. Many of you are aware that the United States, under President Trump, has been very vocal about criticizing NATO allies that have not met the consensus pledge from 2014 to spend that 2% on defense. But one might argue that the United States' position substantively on that issue is relatively unmoved since the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower, of course, one of the founding fathers of NATO, who served as the first Supreme Allied Commander and then later President of the United States during the 1950s, remarked in those times that if the United States still was spending to maintain a substantial military presence in Europe in 10 years, that is, by the 1960s, if America was still in Europe in the 1960s, then the whole NATO project would have failed. That sounds extreme by today's standards, but this is a long-standing view in American foreign policy about burden sharing. And in fact, compared to other 21st century US presidents, The substance of the current administration's policy is consistent with that of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Robert Gates, who was U.S. Secretary of Defense to both Presidents Bush and Obama, famously explained this position, along with a warning that Americans would eventually lose patience with the status quo, in his valedictory speech to the alliance in 2011. So there's substantive consistency about the American view on burden sharing. There's also a substantive consistency about the European view. European countries have responded to external threats and internal alliance politics. European states since 2014 have committed to an additional $100 billion equivalent of spending on defense. This is nowhere near shifting the historical balance of financing between the United States and the Allies, but it is $100 billion is no small sum by most reckoning. Moreover, many European countries have been involved in other ways that deserve recognition. The most significant of those is the fact that NATO allies and the institutions have remained remarkably consistent in their commitment to the mission in Afghanistan, a country that European countries would quite frankly mention is less than of the first order of importance or priority to their country's foreign policy, but they do it for NATO. As one senior NATO military representative said at a meeting of the military committee in Washington some months ago, Afghanistan was not important to my country, but our alliance in NATO is. We went there for you, and that's why we're still there. Europeans and Americans thus both feel that they've shouldered heavy burdens. They both resent claims otherwise, and they seek relief wherever possible. So this burden sharing issue is nothing new. American attitudes about contributions to the alliance are also remarkably dedicated by historical standards. President Trump is known for having criticized the alliance and criticized some of its members for issues like not living up to the Wales Pledge on defense spending. But it's important to note that the substance of his administration's policy towards the alliance and European defense includes some of the largest increases in American military power in Europe since the end of the Cold War. Billions of dollars of increased investment through an American initiative called the European Deterrence Initiative, American rotational battle groups in Eastern Europe in a NATO initiative called Enhanced Forward Presence, a high-profile consideration of new U.S. bases in Poland, Romania, and Greece. These are just a few examples of some of the material increases in U.S. commitment to European security under the present administration. There's also strong, deep, and broad support for NATO in other quarters in the United States. Both chambers of the U.S. Congress, for example, overwhelmingly support NATO, which is striking not only because of the rarity of a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Congress on any issue, but also because Congress has not always favored NATO in such terms. As an example of the bipartisan support in the legislature for NATO, it's worth noting that no leader of any international organization has ever addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress, except the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who did so just last year. The American people, the citizenry, also support NATO by unprecedented margins. A recent poll by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which annually conducts a survey of American attitudes on foreign policy, last year tracked the highest level of support for NATO among American citizens ever, the previous high score having been achieved just 1 year earlier. So the breadth and depth of support for the alliance across the U.S. government, foreign policy establishment, the Congress, the citizenry at large, this, together with the real increase in U.S. presence and defense investment in Europe, all speaks to a steady and continuing commitment of the United States to the alliance. So, Where are we so far in our application of the historical lessons to the present day? We've seen new crises. We've seen some familiar answers, an attempt to explore European-only solutions to the challenges of the day. We've seen some adaptation in NATO. We've seen in that adaptation of NATO the resurgence of some very familiar tension points among the allies about burden sharing and other issues. Where does that leave us? And how does the present crisis compare to other instances of crises in the alliance? One of the last major points that I want to make is this, that the present crisis, as much as it seems bad because it's the one that dominates our headlines today, is, I think, by historical standards, fairly mild. Transatlantic relations have certainly been better than they are today, but there are, and have been, much deeper and much more substantive crises in transatlantic relations and in the alliance before. To note just a couple of examples, consider the Suez Crisis of 1956. At the height of the Cold War, when the United States sided with the Soviet Union, opposed France and the United Kingdom, while each had military forces in harm's way in the Middle East, and the United States even waged economic warfare on the United Kingdom in order to compel the capitulation of its NATO allies. While this was happening, by the way, the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. That was a serious crisis in transatlantic relations. I don't think it's that bad today. As a rebuke of NATO institutions, there was none worse than France's 1966 expulsion of NATO institutions and NATO forces from that country. There is no historical parallel to that sort of rebuke of the alliance institutions. Style-wise, consider the 2003 transatlantic trauma over the Iraq War, an experience that the contemporaneous U.S. ambassador to NATO described as a near-death experience for the alliance, with diplomats shouting at each other in impassioned tones during formal proceedings, a spectacularly petty and juvenile expression of contempt in the U.S. Congress, renaming of French fries as freedom fries in the House cafeteria. And French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin hurling abuse with U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in dueling televised remarks that today, no doubt, might occur on Twitter. None of these, the Suez Crisis, the French expulsion of NATO, or the transatlantic trauma over the Iraq War, were proud moments for the alliance, but their recollection of these hard times ought to provide at least some reassurance of the resilience of these institutions. So overall, I argue we're not really in a crisis. It's much more constructive to think of this as a critical juncture in the alliance that fits a well-established pattern of such junctures in history. The most likely way ahead is a muddling through the current array of challenges, however daunting they may be. NATO will likely adapt in incremental and functional ways that are pragmatic and sensible, but also painstaking and take longer than many would hope. The current sense of crisis will take its place in history. Standalone EU efforts will probably come up short, but collaboration and incorporation of European efforts is also likely. Bold change remains possible, and the current environment, including and perhaps especially because of its great challenges, might really warrant some bold action. Some of the challenges that we face today are familiar. The Russia challenge, terrorism even, regional stability. Other challenges are newer, such as the implications of advanced technology, conflict in the domain of cyberspace, other broader shifts in the balance of great power attending the rise of China. Some of these new challenges may be an opportunity for bold new thinking that draw on the historical record of NATO's successes. The December 2009 NATO summit meeting in London was a small indicator that the alliance is waking up to some of these challenges and opportunities. A new transatlantic bargain that recognizes the value of the historically proven methods of adaptation, but also recognizes new challenges, would need to start with some adjustments on both sides of the Atlantic. And here are my concluding recommendations. In the United States, the new transatlantic bargain ought to begin with a back-to-basics accounting of Europe's potential. The European Union and the United Kingdom together represent the United States' largest trading partners. They represent the two largest economies in the world and each other's most integrated trade and economic partners. Europe, through NATO, is the location of most American treaty allies. And particularly in contrast to the world wars of the last century, the legacy of transatlantic partnership during the last 70 years has been one of the greatest historical triumphs of peace and prosperity ever, hugely successful on both sides. Such facts underline the common interest in security and prosperity that are the basics of the transatlantic alliance, whatever its institutional forms. But a U.S. view of Europe as important should also encourage and accommodate one of greater strength and maturity for Europe as a security actor. European non-dependence on the United States could free both Europe and the United States to share defense burdens more satisfactorily, a shared goal of both European and American leaders, including, and perhaps especially, President Trump. A stronger Europe, a stronger United Kingdom that is less dependent on the United States for its security frees all countries to allocate resources elsewhere. A stronger and less dependent Europe also gives the United States greater incentives to value and to seek partnership with European countries to tackle shared regional and global challenges. My recommendations for Europe. Europe, for its part, would be well served to learn the lessons of its previous efforts at defense integration within the European Union, to abandon duplicative institutional efforts that end up undermined from lack of consensus within, but also from Atlanticist forces within Europe that want to keep the United States in, as Lord Ismay would say. Instead, Europe could pursue greater leadership in NATO. A foundation for success already exists, building on the legacy of 70 years of adaptation within the alliance institutions, appreciating the historical lessons of how NATO adapts and what kind of adaptations tend to work best, and seizing the potential momentousness of this current feeling of crisis, this critical juncture, as well as the momentum of opportunity that might derive from closer NATO-EU institutional cooperation and a shared transatlantic interest in a stronger European defense. Such a more European-run NATO was the original vision of Eisenhower, Ismay, and many of other NATO founding figures. So we go back to the future in thinking about how to address the crises of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. This was fascinating. With about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Please.
So, do you think with the rise of China and Xi trying to become more of a Maoist figure in the China with what they're doing in Africa and the threat that they are of trying to take power in Europe, do you think that China's drive for dominance is going to increase the likelihood of a stronger transatlantic NATO pact?
I think it's a real possibility. It's remarkable that, as I mentioned earlier, the word China appeared in an official NATO communique for the first time just last year. China is on NATO's agenda. My understanding of the way that NATO is looking at China is that NATO is less concerned now about thinking of China as an overt military threat, but more concerned about what economic competition might mean. might mean for the alliance and for Europe. And this takes two flavors. One, I think, is a concern about potential espionage, critical infrastructure, the 5G telephone network, for example. Another concern is about the potential translation of Chinese economic interests and power in Europe into political influence. When one looks at, for example, the acquisition and ownership of physical infrastructure like port facilities in the Mediterranean. So it's possible. NATO has started to move in the direction of thinking about what China means, but so far it's less of a military conversation and more of a general competition and confrontation.
Thank you for the lecture, Dr. Johnston. This was basically the third lecture I had by American academics on European security. I listened to Stephen Wald, I listened to Andrew Moravcik at my old university, and all were saying how strong the support for NATO was of the US and how much they, at the same time, wish stronger support of Europe and a stronger Europe in the North Atlantic Alliance. But why should that happen as long as the American support is so strong? And everybody says nothing is changing in that view towards NATO. I think a lot of European head of states are quite comfortable with the way NATO was run so far. So where's the incentive for change?
I think you very eloquently just explained the essence of the burden sharing problem and why it is never resolved, why it is a consistent tension that on the one hand, strong American support is reassuring, but it undermines the incentive for European countries to shoulder more of the burden. That's the American perspective. On the other side of it, there is consistently this push for more European autonomy, more European decision-making. Do we need to listen to the Americans all the time? Do the Americans have to be the leaders in NATO? Ought the Europeans have more of a say-so or have more of an ability to undertake their own initiatives? These tensions have never been resolved, but they continue to crop up. So I'm not surprised that this is a common theme in the lectures, because it's a common theme, I think, in the history. I don't know if this dynamic will ever be fully reconciled.
Yes, please.
Can I be self-indulgent and comment really on the element you've just been addressing? Can you hear me, or can I manage to switch this on? Okay. I usually shout loud enough, but
Yeah.
there is a thing called, I think, the European Leadership Network. I was in the diplomatic service, and recently talking to the guy who is the chair there. And I said to him, Adam, how are you funded? Oh, well, we're a European leadership network. You can't expect Europeans to fund that. We're, of course, US funded. Anyway, that's kind of anecdotal. My question is not so much about Transatlantic Alliance, it's about Braindead, ? I was involved, if one thinks back in 97-ish, the Russians were kind of fairly positively engaged in what was going on in Bosnia. Within the quaintly named Office of the High Representative, there were Russian diplomats, and the relationship was quite constructive. It seems another era, sadly. Was that because there was not enough imagination? Was NATO, were the members of NATO being brain dead about Russia, not concocting enough incentives for cooperation? Or was there little that could be done about the direction that Putin took Russia into a much more antagonistic approach?
When President Macron described or used that term, he said what we are witnessing now is the brain death of the alliance, and this was in the context of an interview for The Economist newspaper. The context of that statement was he was referring to coordination on foreign policy between or among NATO allies. Not necessarily, my read on what he was trying to say was was that it wasn't that the institutional mechanisms of NATO were not functioning well, but that NATO allies were not always coordinating their foreign policies with one another, even on aspects of foreign policy that were not connected to the North Atlantic area. I don't know if the same kind of phrase would have been appropriate for discussion in the 1970s or earlier eras, but I think that you can see a well-established pattern of not just military, but also political and diplomatic innovations within the alliance to deal with new challenges. That's been a very consistent feature of how NATO adapts. One of the best examples of it, I think, was not in the 70s, but just prior, after the critical juncture of the French withdrawal from the NATO military system. NATO embarked on a very self-critical study on what it called the future tasks of the alliance, and issued a report that became known as the Harmel Report, that established a strong component of diplomacy and dialogue with the Cold War adversaries as central to NATO's purpose. That reorientation, or that orientation towards diplomacy and dialogue, was a big shift in the alliance. And I think that that historical pattern is something that we can still see today. When we have big crises and people are raising the alarm, that's when we have opportunities for bold action. Have I answered your question, sir?
I think so. In that it perhaps wasn't then kind of thinking was as a crisis that would stimulate different thinking, but maybe a slow drift by Russia into a different position. So maybe there wasn't the stimulus needed to deliver that would have prompted an adequate response.
Yeah, fair enough. Change in NATO, even when it's momentous, is often painstaking and slow.
The gentleman back.
Thank you. Do you think there's a danger of peace breaking out at any time, or is it in the national psyche to sort of always need an enemy?
I hope we see peace breaking out. NATO's approach to it, in fact, is that peace and security is central to their business. That's the goal. How that is achieved is a matter of adapting its organization and its strategy to the challenge of the time. Sometime, as in the 1960s, the evaluation was that there ought to be more of a role for dialogue and diplomacy to prevent conflict. At other times, there's been more emphasis on what military types and NATO types call deterrence, the idea that strength is the best way to prevent the outbreak of a conflict. I have confidence in the record. In the 70s, NATO celebrated its 70th birthday last year. In the 70 years leading to the 1940 campaign of World War II, France was invaded by Germany 3 times. There were 3 great power European wars in the 70 years before World War II. In the 70 years of NATO, there have been none. I think that's some indicator that we're onto something, that great power competition and conflict never entirely goes away. But with an alliance like this, and the dedication of its practitioners and the support of its citizenry, we may be able to keep that record up.
Thank you very much. I found your lecture very interesting indeed, but perhaps maybe a tad congratulatory and perhaps even complacent. Do you think NATO has made any strategic mistakes in modern times? And what I'm thinking about in particular, perhaps you can reflect upon it, some very eminent thinkers in your country reckon that the NATO enlargement to the east is what lost us Russia, and indeed allowed President Putin to assume power in the first instance. There's also an argument that a big strategic mistake was made in attacking Serbia for 6 months, when Serbia had not attacked a single NATO country or killed a single NATO soldier, and that NATO lost its moral high ground and indeed its strong legal position that NATO would not attack anyone until it was attacked. And perhaps the third strategic mistake was not actually to do anything in Syria. Much of post-Cold War NATO was justified, its continuation, by addressing risks and challenges and crises around the NATO periphery. And I'd like to suggest that there has been no bigger risk, challenge, and indeed crisis than the catastrophe of Syria, and that NATO perhaps really ought to have used its immense military might to prevent the catastrophe that we've seen in Syria. Could you reflect upon these 3 potential strategic mistakes that were made?
Yes, thanks very much, and it's a great question. I might also add to this list NATO's intervention in Libya in 2012, and we could have a conversation. In fact, there is a conversation happening here in Scotland about lessons from NATO's involvement in Afghanistan these many years. So it's an important question. On enlargement, let me take these in turn. Anyone looking for a master's thesis idea, I strongly encourage you to look at NATO enlargement. There's just been a trove of new documents, declassified, that really shows some of the intentions of the key actors during the 1990s. This is a rich field of study. There is, my view, a tension between the values and aspirations of NATO and the hard military and security realities of the alliance as well. And it's nicely explained in the North Atlantic Treaty, in the article that leaves an open door to new members joining the alliance. It establishes only 3 criteria for what a new member of the alliance might be. It has to be a European country. It has to reflect the values that the alliance is meant to uphold and sustain, and those are enumerated as individual liberty, the rule of law, and democracy. But then the other criteria is that the new applicant country or potential new country of NATO needs to be in a position to contribute to the collective defense of the alliance. And I think the debate that you see about NATO enlargement was one that for a time may have emphasized the aspirational values and risked some of the questions about contributing to the collective defense. I think this is an open question and one of tension. I'd like to see a master's thesis answer your question on that point, sir. On Libya, I think it's fair to say the outcome of NATO's intervention there was not successful. Full stop. On Afghanistan, I would encourage those focused or those interested in the role of NATO's activity in Afghanistan to look at a special issue series of publications coming out of a conference just down the road last year at St. Andrews University on NATO's lessons from Afghanistan and the lessons that NATO member countries took from their involvement there. I think the jury is out about whether that has been successful or not. On the Balkans as well, I think there are good arguments to be made in both directions. On the one hand, the civil wars there are over. On the other hand, Russia frequently cites the choice of NATO allies not to take a decision to become militarily involved in that part of the world to the United Nations Security Council and to act on their own. This may have set, or at least this set a precedent that for Russian public information purposes, has justified some of their adventurism elsewhere. And to your point about Syria, the best I think I can do is to say that the dominant historical analogies that I think were in the minds of policymakers when considering whether to become involved in Syria was that they looked at what had happened in Libya, they looked at what had happened in Iraq and elsewhere, and they concluded that perhaps the power and influence of Western militaries or Western governments to be able to solve large problems like that in that part of the world was limited. You have, I think, proposed an important research agenda for how we could look at improvement of the Transatlantic Alliance. My overarching argument is that NATO and the alliance exists really to prevent the kind of big wars that ravaged this continent and that twice drew my country into them as well. On that record, the alliance has been successful. Can it do better on some of these points? Of course.
We have time for one final question.
I was going to ask more specifically what NATO was actually for, but then that last remark kind of gave me something. In an age of nuclear war, can there actually be land warfare between major European powers anymore? Is that even a possibility? Because considering how the ways in which power is actually projected these days via economic means and also via corporate espionage via the Chinese and also through general economic means, money, power, and so forth, if you're up against a country which has a nuclear arsenal, you don't really want to engage them directly. It's always going to be via proxy wars these days. That's what's happening in Ukraine between Russians funding their own insurgency and the US throwing one or two Blackwater contractors their way to help out and so forth. I don't think the way the alliance maybe projects itself is true to what its actual functions are going to be in the future. Certainly, I don't think it's currently how it portrays itself now. It's certainly in a flux of what its real purpose actually is anymore. I don't really have much of a question, but that's what I have to add.
Okay. Well, on the question of nuclear weapons, this is an important one as well, and also a great master's thesis idea about what does deterrence look like today, particularly as NATO is looking at what conflict in the domain of cyberspace or in the domain of outer space might look like. In the beginning of NATO, the decision makers took your point and concluded that in a world in which great powers had nuclear weapons, conflict was unlikely because conflict of any kind was unthinkable. And so NATO's official doctrine in those days was massive retaliation. Any kind of breach of international security would lead to a massive use of nuclear weapons, and that would be so unthinkable that adversaries wouldn't do it. Later, it became clear that that was not true, that actually conventional war happened in the nuclear age. It happened in Korea, and the divided Korea, the instance of conventional warfare there, drew or encouraged analogies about what might happen on a divided European continent as well.
I'd stop you there, but you're not really mentioning wars that are actually between nuclear powers, I don't think.
Interestingly, the documents that have come out recently have shown that while not known at the time, US and Soviet aircraft fought each other directly during the Korean War.
That would be a proxy, more of a proxy action, something of plausible deniability.
I think this is your point. Yeah, people realized that a simple massive retaliation, a simple clarity about conflict in the nuclear age was not going to be forthcoming, and so there needed to be a range of what NATO then ended up calling flexible response options for how to deal with these kinds of scenarios. And I think that's where we've been ever since, flexible response. Increasingly now what you're seeing is that the types of responses include not only military means, but as you also suggested, economic means, information means, and others. So conflict has become more complex as we've gone into these new domains, but I think the underlying logic of flexible response that NATO arrived at in the 1960s still has lessons for us today.
Thank you so much. I wished we could go on all evening. Unfortunately, we can't. We're out of time. So please join me in thanking Dr. Johnston for coming all the way from the United States to join us tonight in Aberdeen to give such an illuminating and clear lecture about where NATO stands, where NATO will be moving, and for being so positive and inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.